Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, a very warm welcome to our first session in a series of podcasts and webinars on transforming transport 10 years on. Time, that is the question to recalculate the route for the future. Our first session today will go about geopolitics and international cooperation, and I'm very happy to welcome to this session my dear colleague and friend in California, Dan Sperling, which I will come later to him. Against the background of the 10th anniversary of Agora Verkehrswende, Agora Transport Transformation, 10 years of the Paris Agreement, and now at the start of the UN-Decade for Sustainable Transport, we thought that it's a good time to reflect how much progress did we see over the last 10 years, where did we succeed, where did we fail, what did we underestimate by making progress over the last time, and what does this mean for the future and the agenda setting for the next decade to come. And again, we will do this in a series, and we will discuss this in a series of webinars and podcasts, and we measure the progress against our 12 insights, which we wrote at the very beginning of our time at Agora, to lay down our basic thinking, our basic ideas, our basis recommendations for driving transport to zero emissions, to climate neutral transport by the mid of the century. We are recording the session today. The recording will be shortly available after the webinar on our website. And again, this will be followed by more sessions which you will be informed about in the near future. Now it's time to welcome, and I'm really very happy to have Dan Sperling with me, the founding director of the Institute for Transportation Studies at UC Davis, the University of California, Davis, Emeritus, and he's a professor for civil and environmental engineering. He studied in Cornell University, did his PhD in the University of California, Berkeley, and started then not only the career at the university, but was a very important representative of the science sector in the California Air Resources Board, a governmental agency handling air quality, air pollution, and carbon emission environmental issues around the Californian legislation. He did this for 16 years, from 2007 to 2023, and he also had the automotive seat in this agency, so he was, when I can say so, the father of the Californian policy on vehicle and fuels regulation over the last decades. A part of working at the university, he also was the head of the National Center for Sustainable Transport, which was the center from the United States Department of Transport, and we will later come back to it. He's a book author of very important books like 2 Million Cars or The Three Revolutions, which we will also refer in our talk, and he was the winner of the Blue Planet Prize, so to say the Nobel Prize for Environmental Sciences, if I can say so. And very important also, he's the host of the Asilomar conference, a conference which is bringing together all stakeholders from the policy sector, policymakers, from science sector, from the industry to debate about the future of environmental and climate policy in the transport sector in the US, but also beyond the US. And he's doing so since 1988. And here we see in the next slide some titles of the conferences he was holding since 1980. So for now over or nearly 40 years of conferences. And you will see that already the second conference in 1991 was called Transportation and Global Climate Change. And the last one, where we met last year again in California, was called Headwind and Tailwinds to a Better Future, which is nothing on climate change here in the title for several reasons, but definitely this is something where we would love to talk about and where we will talk about. And when Dan started his work in California, I started my studies here in 1988. We had a professor on air pollution referring to the Los Angeles smog and the work against the Los Angeles smog. And he introduced at this time, for the first time ever, that California thinking about introducing vehicles without local emissions, zero emission vehicles. So this is when the legislation already starts, and the man or one man behind this is definitely Dan Sperling. And maybe Dan, you can just introduce us a little bit about maybe the first or second decade of what you call the golden age of regulation, driving air quality and lower CO2 emissions, climate protection, climate action in the transport sector in California. First of all, a very warm welcome. Great to have you with us, Dan, and the floor is yours.
Well, Christian, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here to participate. But you did make me feel really old going back so far in history. So, but we've all learned age brings with it wisdom and experience. So it does go back. So if we give a history of, I'll start with California, because I like to say I'm from the nation state of California. I do say that more often recently than I used to. So back in the 1970s and 80s, air quality was a huge challenge, a huge political issue, a huge environmental issue in California. California did lead the US and the world in adopting policies and regulations dealing with air pollution. So 1990 was an important date because that's when the California Air Resources Board adopted the zero emission vehicle mandate for California. And it said that by 2003, 10% of all vehicles must be zero emission. Now, of course, we never achieved it, and one of the hallmarks of the agency is, and it's different than a lot of regulatory agencies, it can be flexible. So when it became obvious that that target was not achievable, it started adapting and coming up with softer regulations and more flexibility and so on. Anyway, but that was strictly about air pollution at that time. And, in practice, greenhouse gases, climate has become a bigger part of the environmental regulations, but the reality is health-based air pollution has more political support generally. So, in the messaging, we still mix together the two, air pollution and climate, even though in reality, many of these are motivated much more by climate. So then we fast forward. So in 2002, California, I believe, adopted the first law in the United States I don't know about globally, but the first law to come to mitigate climate change. And it was a law to essentially adopt greenhouse gas performance standards for vehicles. 2006 is when California adopted a comprehensive law that would cap and trade. So this was following Europe. Europe had already adopted the EST, and so so then we adopted a whole series of laws and regulations at that point for much stronger. The zero emission vehicle standard was strengthened, a low carbon fuel standard was adopted, and many other policies and rules affecting climate change. And so that all went forward at that point, a pretty steep trajectory. The US government, under Obama, came up with some pretty aggressive vehicle standards in 2012. But, along in concert with California. But of course, it all, when Trump first came in 2016, that slowed things down. And now, of course, the Trump administration has taken a very strong position against climate change, against electric vehicles. So now it's much more of a struggle.
Yeah, but before we come to this, the question was, when did you first realize that, it's not, an incremental way forward to increase and have a better performance of the vehicles, but this will really be a transformational change in the automotive industry, and that not only a share of the vehicles will be electric, but the whole portfolio at the end will come, in the Californian case, to become battery electric or fuel cell and hydrogen electric in this sense. When did you feel, that's what really transformed the industry?
Yeah. So in 2012, we had, along with the federal government, we did adopt rules. In California, it did require zero emission vehicles, but it was going to require about 10 or 15% ZEVs, zero emission vehicles, by 2025. But it soon became apparent that that was a very weak, not very ambitious. So it was in 2020 when California adopted a requirement for 100% of all vehicles sales must be zero emission by 2035, which of course aligned with pretty much what the European Commission was doing at that time. But California was a little bit ahead in adopting it. And then 2 years later, adopted a similar requirement for trucks. So the 2020 requirement was for light duty vehicles. 2022 was for medium and heavy duty trucks. And we also did for buses about the same time.
At this time, I remember very well that we did a joint conference here in Berlin, and I don't know if you remember this. It was called Decarbonized Transportation. We did this in cooperation. When you said, well, California has all the policies now in place. We have to, improve them and tighten them and further development then. But at the end, did you already think at this time that it was a done deal, that this transformation, was something which was agreed on, and we will follow down the road, so that we were on the winning line here?
I did think it was a done deal. I thought it would probably take a little longer than what we had put into regulations, but I thought it was a done deal. We were on the trajectory. Electrification, especially the cost of batteries, was coming down at a steep rate. It just looked like everything was headed in the right direction.
And what did we then, or did you then underestimate for not foreseeing that now, the regulation and also the achievements for climate protection in the transport sector by the electrification of the road transport are really under threat, and are really, a little bit lost in transformation at this time?
That's a great question, Christian. Uh, you know, in California, I think there's still the same commitment. And if it really was a nation state, then we would be still committed to those requirements. Unfortunately, you know, many of many of our rules are subject to the federal government's issuing waivers to implement them. And so the problem, I mean, it is this populist uprising that we've seen in both Europe and the US, which Trump, Donald Trump kind of epitomizes. And it's, they've politicized the issue much more than seems appropriate or needed, but they did. So in the US, electric vehicles are seen as something very, or the Trump administration is portraying electric vehicles as something very negative, bad, you know, raises costs, not good for consumers, unnecessary. And it's that messaging, I think, that's been really crucial here. So, the market is moving forward on certainly with solar energy, wind energy, and electric vehicles. But, when consumers keep hearing, from the president that, this is a bad idea, this is stupid even, he uses, even worse words than that. It sends a clear message, and then you take away the incentives, you take away the regulations, and it sends a message. And industry, I think, has been too passive in its response to that. Uh, but that's a whole nother issue. So it's created this whole environment, a narrative that really undermines the commitment. And the reality is, electric vehicles, for instance, make so much sense economically as well as environmentally if you look at it from a total cost of ownership basis. But that message doesn't get through.
I mean, you mentioned that we in Europe at this time, when Ursula von der Leyen and the European Commission came up with the European Green Deal, we were, California and Europe, very much on the same line, right? On the same pathway. When in Europe the industry started the discussion, no, we don't want to be forced in one technology pathway. We would like to have this technology neutral, technology open approach. And this is why they pushed very hard, and now we see in Europe that this legislation which we had, the 100% zero emission vehicles by 2035, is now opened, and we will see it will be negotiated this year where we end. But at the same time, I know that companies like BMW and Volkswagen, they supported the Californian regulation with a 100% ZEV goal in 2035 while lobbying against it here in Europe. How can you, what do you think, what is the reason for this, contrast, for this paradoxon, which we will see and which we have seen between California and Europe?
I recall, so I was overseeing these regulations in California, and I do recall there was no pushback, almost no pushback on that 100% requirement from the car companies. They were arguing about little things, about whether they should be required to have a adapter provided with the vehicle, for a charger. But there was no opposition to the 100, almost no opposition to the 100%. Now, in the case of BMW and VW, and I guess some other companies, California was a small enough market. I mean, it's still a big market. It's about 2 million vehicles a year, but it was small enough that they could look at it as a laboratory, an experiment. And I think in the EU and US nationally, they had a different attitude. And I have to say that um, I did, this 100% requirement, what I've learned, in the beginning, I thought it's really important to have that 100% because it sends a very clear signal, a very clear message. And this transition does require lots of different parties
Yeah.
to coalesce around this goal, the utilities, charging companies, local governments, and so on. So you need something that really gets everyone's attention. What I didn't fully appreciate is that when you do that, you also create the situation where can be a backlash. People, whether for political reasons or economic reasons, they oppose it. And that's what happened in Europe and in US in a different way. And so I think the 100% was not reasonable. I think like the EU is really 90% now. I think that's fine if they stick to the 90% reduction because it is a pretty fast transition. And we got their attention. So I think if the European Union can stick to that 90% number, I'm kind of comfortable with that. Some kind of flexibility is appropriate, I think, for both consumers and industry.
Plug-in hybrid vehicles will play a huge role in this regulation because they were or they under the regulation they are seen as quite effective with regard to the share of electric drive, with regard of emission reduction, but in real terms they are not performing much better than a very efficient combustion engine car. So do we really need this plug-in hybrids anymore as a bridging technology to purely battery electric vehicles from your perspective?
I think yes, and so I should say I was a champion for including plug-in hybrids. When California first adopted the ZEV mandate, it was with a very small role for plug-in hybrids, and it was even called a transitional technology. Um, but I think there's a couple things going on here. So I think one is Europe has not managed the regulation and the incentives for plug-in hybrids very well. And so it's given too much credit. And with the company cars,
Mm.
there's no mechanism to make sure that they're actually charged. And a lot of people don't, they just treat it as, a vehicle they get a good deal on. And so they're not really committed to the electric part of it. So I think, and I know Europe's been changing the test procedures and so on. So I think if the test procedures can be tightened up, the incentives can be improved. I do think plug-in hybrids are important because, in a democratic society, it's very hard to give absolute directives to consumers or companies for that matter. And flexibility, it's part of the political process. I think that you need some amount of flexibility because there are people and companies and users that are going to be in circumstances where a pure battery V doesn't fit well, or maybe they're just ideologically opposed. And so you can't fight everyone.
But you can fight with good arguments, and I think there, at least from my perspective, and it's good that we have a little also difference in our opinions here. In my opinion, that you know many arguments for plug-in hybrids will not be important anymore in the next years, especially after 2030. I think it will be even maybe more cost intensive and less effective than battery electric vehicles when the performance will improve. But
Yeah.
we
So
see now
Christian,
that, yeah,
well,
no,
let me
no,
just say one thing. I agree with you on that. So one of the reasons I'm okay with a little flexibility is because the pure electric vehicles are obviously the superior option from a technology perspective in terms of complexity. They're much simpler than plug-in hybrids. From a cost perspective, instead of having two power plants on the vehicles. So I think the pure battery EVs are going to win out in the end. And that's why I'm a little more comfortable with a little flexibility because it is a superior option that will eventually win.
Very good. One important driver, at least for a couple of years, and it should be even more now, is not only regulation, but it's the Chinese competitors. And I know that the two of us were working a lot in China, and that was when we first met or were in contact to each other. I was, based in Beijing for the German Technical Corporation and started the cooperation with the Chinese side, and we were thinking about doing a webinar, no, not a webinar this time, it's seminar on the integration of EVs in fuel economy standards. So I wrote an email to you asking would you come to China, not knowing you very well, but then I was surprised that you called me back and said, well, Christian, I cannot come by myself, but I will send Nick Latze, who's now the head of governmental affairs worldwide at GM. And China at this time already in 2010, 2012, 2013 started with implementing the master plan for the electrification of their road transport system. And in 10 years now, and we were the last year together in Beijing at the China EV 100 conference, we saw, well, okay, they are moving very fast ahead. And, but the arguments which will be used now for slowing the transformation in Europe and maybe also in the US down is first, China doesn't have a ZEF mandate from a national perspective. So they are also now looking at combustion engine cars and plug-in hybrids, but they also, have combustion engine cars in their strategy. So we should not, phase them out over time. What is, your argument or your guess? Is China really focusing also on combustion engine cars, or is this a rumor which cannot be supported, and it's just a rumor which helps to destroy effective regulation here in Europe?
I don't believe from everything I know that they're going to embrace combustion engine vehicles at all. I think they're being a little flexible in how fast they continue to move, but the market has pretty much taken over. So remember, Christian, when we were there at EV 100, it was very impressive to me that the government and the industry was saying, electrification, done deal. We're now moving to the next phase, what they called intelligent vehicles. And they were focused on automation and driver assistance and even little planes, electric and automated planes for urban mobility. So I think they have no interest in sustaining any commitment to combustion engine vehicles anymore. For oil, this conflict now in the Middle East just reinforces the idea that none of us should want to be dependent on oil. Shifting to electricity, it's a domestic energy source. It's much more secure and reliable. Air pollution, the other thing that struck me when we were in China is the cities are so quiet and clean. Remember back in 2010, they were noisy and polluted.
Absolutely.
Really, the transit, we talk about it theoretically. It's almost like theoretically, you said, well, electric vehicles are quiet, and so that's an advantage. But to actually experience that in an ambient way, you're standing there and you go, wow, this is so different from, you know, Paris or Berlin or New York. It's quiet. So, and they still have their air pollution in a lot of their cities is still a major problem. So I think they're absolutely committed to electrification. Their industry is all electrification now. You know, all the leading companies, they are exporting a lot of combustion engine cars to the rest of the world. Maybe that's the part maybe that you're thinking about and that they want to keep that going because some countries are going to be much slower to transition and to electrification for a variety of reasons and they are looking for that export outlet. And so combustion cars do play a role.
But the strength now in EVs, and we discussed it very often, for example, a couple of years ago in Ghent, together with you, the strength in their positioning now, industrial positioning, driving electrification, having, now, or being the world leader for batteries, for EV technologies, also brings a lot of now protectionism, especially to the US, but also now we see tariffs for electric vehicles from China to Europe. How do you think we should balance between this competitiveness, competition between countries to avoid competition between cars? What is the right way forward? Is the US way to keep the Chinese out of the market the right way forward from your perspective?
The US strategy is a losing strategy. Because what's happening is the US companies are just becoming lagging even further behind on innovation and investment. So the electrification generally is going to happen, and the Chinese are going to come into the US market eventually. Canada just made an agreement where they're letting in small amount of vehicles, of electric vehicles. Mexico is doing the same thing. Even President Trump, who's a very transactional business guy, he said, hey, if the Chinese companies come in and hire US workers and invest in the US, then fine with me. He changes his mind every day, so I'm not sure that's, but it's inevitable. I think the European approach is basically the right one. Joint ventures, investments in Europe, protection for the, whether through content requirements and through incentives to help out the legacy companies. All of that's important. You've got me in all my whole selection of hats there, Christian.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, I cannot, surprise you with different haircuts, but that's my fault, not yours. Now, coming back to this question, I also think that a strategy for localizing industries and then having a fair level playground or playing field in the markets, in China, in the US, and in Europe would definitely, from my point of view, be the right strategy. On the one hand, to also foster the competition between companies, and on the other hand, also to make those products which are great and getting greater and greater also available for customers. So would you think that the Chinese would kick out the automotive industry in the US and in Europe from the global markets if we will be more open to China?
Well, I think a lesson we learned when China was first admitted into the World Trade Organization in 2001, 2002, in the US, for instance, we put up we did almost nothing to protect the US industry, manufacturing industry. And they did wipe out much of the industrial investment, industrial activity in the US. And so that's kind of a lesson learned that we need to manage the process, you know, while engaging with them, but managing the transition. Like I kind of said, supporting the legacy car companies, providing incentives, make sure there's joint venture, their entry is through joint ventures. And I give an example. So like in the US back in the 1970s, the Japanese um, came in big time into the US because the US car companies, really it's a deja vu situation. The US car companies were making big cars. They were gas guzzlers, they were not very efficient, they were polluting, and even the quality was not very good because they were an oligopoly. They didn't really have that much competition. So the Japanese came in and everyone was freaking out. Okay, the Japanese are going to take over the industry. But they came in, they built factories in the US, and they did get more market share, but they provided the motivation, and the innovation to really improve, automobile manufacturing, both quality, efficiency, pollution. Honda was one of the leaders in reducing emissions with some of their innovations. And in the end, so now, fast forward, the Japanese do account for about 40% of the US car market, light duty vehicle market. And that's fine. So I think the challenge is for the US, for Europe, Europe is on the front line now. So it's really critical what Europe does is figure out how do you slow the process? How do you protect your own companies, your own industrial might? Because it's a security issue as well as an economic issue, to have that capacity. As Europe builds up its military capacity, a lot of that is tied very closely to the industrial capacity of the auto industry going forward. So, um, but all of I'm speaking as a more of a scientist and an academic as opposed to an activist. So, a little bit what we were talking about plug-in hybrids. If you put me into a role where I have to, go and write and lobby, I would be much more closely aligned with you. But I think as an academic, I say, okay, we need some flexibility. We need to figure this out. But, so that's why there's a role for the activists and there's a role for the researchers.
Exactly. But the question, what we also already discussed in 2018 when we had this joint conference, was some question which we also would love to put on Slido today, which was the question at this time that, oh, I can't read it. Loosening the climate sound vehicle regulation in the US and Europe, as well as slowing down the transformation, will this strengthen or weaken the industrial base in the long term? So what is your guess? And we also invite our auditory to join this Slido session. If you just click to the QR code, then you will be directed to this question, and we are very much looking forward to the answer to this. I know the answer still from 2018, but let's see if the answer changed over time, or if also our arguments made the people change over time now, or at least for this auditory. Do we have the results? We getting the results? Otherwise,
When
yeah, please go
when I
ahead.
started studying transportation, we didn't get into all these questions of industrial policy, world trade, battery, critical minerals, electric utilities. It's just an indication how the world is becoming much more complicated. And, it's really it's more difficult really to figure out the best strategies now with everything connected to everything. Okay, what do we
Okay,
have?
here we have the results. It's pretty clear. Can be that the listener and the auditory of Agora has a clear opinion, but can be that we also now, that this opinion, what I would share, is also quite broad, accepted and quite broadly seen as the reality that, as you mentioned, try to find a balance between trying to find the right pace and the right acceleration and scale for this transformation is definitely key. One lobbying argument in
Christian,
Germany
if
is,
this was done in the United States, it would have been
yeah,
very different. It would have been very different. I think the Trump administration has convinced many people that weakening the rules is good for the industrial base.
but yeah, what was your guess? We didn't ask you. What will be the future of GM and Ford if the regulation stays as it is? If now the rules which have been introduced by the Trump administration will continue in the next years ahead.
I think it's a disaster for them because they're just going to continue atrophying. They'll just become, a North American companies that serve only North America and only, big SUVs and pickup trucks. And it's going to be a shrinking market. And it turns out pickups and SUVs are the hardest ones to convert to electrification because they need much bigger batteries. So unless they downsize them, which is not what they want to do. So I think it's a disaster for the U.S. industrial base and the U.S. industry.
An argument which we hear a lot from the automotive industry in Europe, especially in Germany, is that we should stick to the combustion engine because the rest of the world, especially Global South also, is still sticking to the combustion engine cars, and that is maybe also a huge market in the future. I know that you were initiating or at least participating a lot in a delegation of the transport, I would call Minister of California, to several African countries to give their support of the transport transformation in Africa. Agora is working a lot on seeing and accompanying this transformation also from our side. And I think, honestly speaking, that was hilarious for me to see over the last years how enthusiastic policymakers, business people, but also civil society is about the idea of leapfrogging the combustion engine car, and in the age of motorization and economic growth starting in Africa, also entering an electrified road transport system. So how did you feel when you were, as a Californian delegation in the African countries, about sticking to the ICE or changing to electrification and building up an electrified road transport system?
I was very proud that the nation state of California had created a partnership
Understood.
with African countries. And my institute is the secretariat for that formal partnership between state of California and some of the countries there. That's a very interesting question because one of the things I came to appreciate in Africa is these are very young countries with institutions that are not so strong. I'm older than most of the countries in Africa. That's what was so stunning to me. I was in Kenya where I first realized that. I'm older than Kenya.
The average age of Africans or people on the African continent is 19. That is, so no matter, I mean, you're still very young and you feel even younger, but I mean, to be older than the average in Africa, that is, it's not a sign to be old.
Yeah, so there are a few countries like Ethiopia has banned the import of gasoline vehicles, and they're moving towards electrification. Kenya, where one of the countries where I was, is also very strongly supporting electrification. They have electric buses, electric motorcycles. The key to that for them, there's two keys. One is they would like to reduce their dependence on oil, both from a security perspective as well as an economic perspective, and replace it with electricity. Now, they are having challenges building up their grids, but that is a strong motivation for them going forward. The other part is the Chinese are sitting there and saying, you want electric vehicles, we can give them to you cheap. And so, and the Chinese, of course, have made big advances in a lot of countries around the world, especially Africa. Like in Kenya, they had just built a whole network of toll roads and a railroad to the port. So, um, and they don't have domestic auto industries to protect. So from their point of view, there is a security perspective becoming overly dependent on the Chinese, and there's a little angst about exploitation. But generally speaking, it's a great opportunity for them, and there's very few downsides to uh, integrating electric vehicles. So I think we're going to see it move much faster into these countries. Electric vehicles move into these countries much faster. We're seeing it in some of the Asian countries,
Yeah.
Thailand, Vietnam. And the Chinese, it's all about the Chinese. And that's just, it used to be not so long ago, all the legacy companies, auto companies, they had a huge presence. They would actually had automotive manufacturing in many of these countries, Brazil and Thailand and so on. And they've given up a lot of it and they've pulled back, and the Chinese are moving in. So this is just another example of how we need to support our legacy companies in Europe and the US to be, not to lag behind. They're lagging behind. At some point, there's no coming back. And so I think the Chinese are coming. We need to embrace them in some way or engage with them in some way, but we've really got to work much harder on motivating and stimulating and supporting our own companies to improve their technology, invest in electrification.
I think it's also a huge chance for at least Europe to, and it would also be for the US, to cooperate with countries, governments, companies, stakeholders in the global south to jointly develop these markets, to jointly do this transformation and getting even more independent from China at the same time. So for me, it's a win-win situation that those countries are transforming much faster than we see in the developed world. And after the COP20 or the last COP in Belém, my impression is also that the signal is we will not wait for you. If you, will not transform your industries, if you will not transform your sector, we will do this together with China, and we will not wait for the former West to, accompany us.
And, there's this idea of brand loyalty. Once the Chinese get in there, that's what people become familiar with. And if you let them just dominate it. So doing these joint ventures is exactly, I think, the right way to go. To, it just necessary. It seems so obvious. I don't,
To me too. Before we come to the summary, because time is flying, unfortunately, but I would love to touch one point because you wrote a book I was really reading very fast, and I enjoyed it very much, which was called The Three Revolutions. And when we did this conference jointly here in Berlin 2018, we had a fabulous fireside chat together with Robin Chase, working or asking the question, will autonomous vehicles drive us through the heaven of transport, heaven of mobility, or also to transport traffic hell? And this is what, before we get into the discussion now, as the autonomous vehicles are arriving, we would love to ask this question once again. You will find it again on Slido. If you use the QR code, you can also give your opinion on the question where autonomous vehicles will take us to. I mean, from my point of view, while the people are voting, I see that currently, and correct me if I don't see it in the right way from your perspective, but the US way is very much on bringing now robotaxis to the cities. It's really very, very little about, it's a new service, it's replacing taxis, but it's very little about pooling. While we are in Europe trying to say, okay, autonomous technologies and automated drive is very much for linking private mobility with public transport and bridging the gap and trying to make the public transport more individual and the individual transport maybe by pooling a little bit more public, so that this is really improving our transport system, reducing CO2 emissions, and bringing more convenient service. How would you now see this while the vehicles are coming? Now it's the time, it's not 2018 when this was far in the future. They are already on the roads in the US, they are already on the roads in China. We have them not on the roads, but beside the roads sometimes. What is your guess about the future of this vision of autonomous vehicles can improve the transport system by pooling, by sharing, and being an alternative in transport, being an alternative also to individual car use and individual car ownership?
So this is a case where policy intervention is necessary and critical. And, if we're concerned about the public interest, and we should be, the social good, then there's a very important role, because if we have no intervention, the result will be that hell scenario, because in the sense that maybe hell is overstating it a little extreme, but it means if there's no policy intervention, it's going to mean most of the automated vehicles will be used for single passenger service, kind of like how Uber operates now. And soon they'll be personally, privately owned. And the result of both of those would be a huge increase in vehicle kilometers traveled. And it's because people, for the companies, it's easier to do it that way. And for consumers or travelers, people, if they have a choice, they'd rather not sit next to someone. Let's put it that way. We get into airplanes because, there's often not a good alternative and we get squeezed in like sardines. But the pandemic was a disaster for the sharing economy, the pooling, because, all of the, like Uber and in the United States, Lyft, they got rid of all of their sharing and pooling services. and because people were supposed to sit 2 meters away from each other. So anyway, so the bottom line is these autonomous automated vehicles can provide huge benefit. They can reduce the cost of travel a lot if you have multiple riders in the same vehicle, and small buses, vans, even cars that handle multiple riders. The cost per passenger goes way down, which means that it becomes accessible to many more people. So Europe has a much better public transportation system than the US. But even in Europe, once you get out of the center cities, it doesn't serve a lot of people, and especially people. And there's people with physical limitations, economic limitations. So it's, pool automated vehicles are probably the most important thing we can do for making transportation more sustainable in the sense of equitable accessibility, cost, environment. But it's not going to happen in a major way unless government intervenes, creates incentives for the pooling and sharing, and disincentives for the single passenger services. So just a simple thing is, if Waymo or some of these companies come in and want to provide these services, you say, okay, there's a large tax on all the single passenger services, but no tax or a very small one on if there's multiple passengers. That would just be a simple way to do it. Now, the challenge is that a lot of this would have to be done at the city level, not necessarily at the European level or the US national level. And that makes it harder and slower. But I think that's one of my big campaigns now is exactly this, because we have such a great opportunity. After electrification, this is the biggest opportunity we have to really make our transportation system better.
Thanks a lot for this strong statement. Unfortunately, we are coming to an end, but I would like to ask you 2 or 3 more questions. Unfortunately, we have to speed up. On your website of the ITS, you're saying, despite the trauma around the world and policy breakdowns here in the United States, I'm more optimistic than ever about our transportation in the future. What makes you so optimistic? I mean, hopefully I can share this optimism because it is my favorite. But what makes you so optimistic, Dan?
It's putting it in kind of a longer time frame than just the next year or two. Yeah, because really until 2010, there was almost no systems innovation in the transportation sector. Since limited access, expressways and containerization, nothing had happened in 60, 70 years in terms of system innovation. 2010 was when electrification really became serious. It's when ride sharing became serious through the, smartphones with apps. It's where automated vehicles first started getting attention through the efforts by Google. And so, yeah, we're having a little blip in the immediate term, but all of those technologies provide so much promise, as we've talked about here. And, I think that's the role for you and me and others, is to steer these technologies and investments in the direction of serving the public interest.
Finally, coming back to the first question, which was opening our discussion, is it necessary after 10 years working on this huge transformation of the transport system to recalculate the route, as we are now in struggle and sometimes also seem to really get lost in transformation? So what is your recommendation for us also? Do you think Agora should recalculate and do something very, very different in the next years to come?
I think the policies and strategies are correct and we need to stick to them. What we need to change is more the narratives and the messaging. We need to be more sensitive to, questions of affordability, of industrial policy and security type issues. And that might lead to some small changes in the policies, but the strategies, I think, are the right ones, and we should stick to it. And we're on the right path in that sense, but we do need to fix our messaging. Even like I told you, the 100% requirement, the good news is it got everyone's attention. The bad news is it created backlash. So, that's just a simple example of it.
Yeah. Well, I know that, and I experienced this, that every last session at your conferences ends with a glass of red wine on the panel. As it is something like 9 in the morning at home at yours, it's just water, Dan. But I would love to take the opportunity to thank you very, very much for this conversation. I would have loved to continue this over the next 1 or 2 hours, and especially over a glass of wine. But hopefully we will have the chance in the very near future to meet each other also in person again and really discuss over a glass of wine. And my wish would be that then, let's say, currently the US government is in the Hotel Florida, but maybe in the future they will also meet the Hotel California by the Eagles. And this is also what I really like in this song, which I think has to do with our joint commitment, with our joint goal and joint objectives and spirit, that maybe you can check out, or no, you can check out the climate agreement, you can check out the endangerment finding for a couple of while or for a couple of years, but you will never be able to leave. So welcome back on board, and especially welcome to you as a guest from the nation state of California. Dan, I'm looking very much forward to see you very soon here in Europe. Thanks again very much, and have a great remaining of the day.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you so much. And I agree, this kind of partnerships and engagement internationally is more important than ever. So thank you for your efforts.
Thanks a lot. I will switch to German. Warum? Weil wir die nächsten Sessions dieser Reihe, es werden 6 sein, über die nächsten Monate für die Frage 10 Jahre Verkehrswende, was können wir daraus lernen, in Deutsch machen werden. Das war die erste Folge mit einem Schwerpunkt, ich hoffe, das haben Sie gemerkt, zum Thema Elektrifizierung, Elektromobilität, globale Elektromobilität und auch die Frage von autonomen Fahren, autonomen Vehikeln in der Zukunft. Das nächste Mal werden wir eine Folge anbieten am 23. April. Die wird sich hauptsächlich mit dem Thema Stadtverkehr und nachhaltige Mobilität beschäftigen, und die darauffolgenden 4 Folgen werden Sie bei uns auf der Webseite angekündigt bekommen oder über den Newsletter. Sie werden es auf jeden Fall mitbekommen, machen Sie sich keine Sorgen. Wir würden uns sehr freuen, wenn Sie wieder mit dabei sind, uns begleiten über dieses Jahr, bis wir dann gegen Ende des Jahres auch nochmal von unserer Seite Bilanz ziehen und vielleicht mit Ihnen gemeinsam dann nochmal diskutieren können, was die Schwerpunkte und Themen für die nächsten Jahre sind, um weitere und vor allen Dingen die wichtigen Fortschritte beim Klimaschutz im Verkehr und bei dem Thema nachhaltige Mobilität und Industrietransformation machen zu können. Herzlichen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit, für Ihre Teilnahme. Hat uns sehr gefreut. Viel Spaß, noch einen schönen Abend hier in Berlin und auf bald. Bleiben Sie uns gewogen und bleiben Sie vor allen Dingen zuversichtlich. auch angesichts der unfriedlichen Zeit. Wir wollen alle und hoffen alle, dass sich das sehr, sehr bald wieder ändert. Herzlichen Dank. Tschüss. Bis bald.